announcing today a major show of military force in the region.
In the early morning hours, a quiet tension hung in the air over the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. A U.S. naval strike group, including one of the most powerful aircraft carriers in the world, was deployed for routine operations. But what started as a typical day at sea quickly descended into one of the most intense and terrifying battles ever fought in modern naval history. Over 1,000 drones, many of them carrying explosive payloads, launched from the shores of Venezuela. Their mission? To overwhelm the U.S. fleet with a relentless multi-wave assault. This wasn't a test or a simulation. It was real combat, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. Imagine a high-tech war machine, the pride of the U.S. Navy, suddenly being swarmed by waves of drones, each one racing toward its target at breakneck speed. It was an attack unlike anything the U.S. military had ever faced. The drones came in waves, designed not only to overwhelm the defenses of the ships, but to find their way through even the most advanced missile defense systems. The strike group wasn't just dealing with a handful of isolated threats. It was facing a calculated, high-stakes attack designed to push every defense system to its absolute limit. The United States had the technological edge, but this wasn't a war of conventional forces. This was asymmetrical warfare, where the enemy, Venezuela, had deployed drones that, while not as sophisticated as the weapons aboard the U.S. fleet, were numerous and cheap, and in the right hands, could be devastating. The attack wasn't just a show of force. It was a demonstration of what the future of naval warfare could look like. As the drones poured in, the U.S. fleet activated its defense systems. Anti-air missiles shot into the sky, intercepting many of the incoming threats. Close-in weapon systems, CIWS, on the ships spun into action, firing thousands of rounds to stop the drones in their tracks. But for every drone destroyed, it seemed that two more were heading straight for the ships. The defense systems, even some of the most advanced in the world, struggled to keep up with the sheer volume of attacks. In the chaos, the threat wasn't just from the drones themselves, but from the vulnerability of the U.S. vessels. On board, the crew members were pushed to their limits. In the midst of the onslaught, the Navy's most sophisticated electronic warfare systems, such as the EA-18G Growler, went into action. These electronic countermeasures began jamming the drones, disrupting their communication, and attempting to force them off course. But not all of the drones were neutralized. Some made it through, striking vital areas of the ships, crippling navigation and command systems, and even damaging critical structures. Despite the ferocity of the counterattack, there were casualties. The damage to the strike group was significant. The vessels had been tested in ways no one had anticipated, but the battle wasn't over yet. As the Navy regrouped, a counteroffensive was launched. The question remained: could the U.S. Navy recover from this unprecedented attack? And more importantly, what lessons would be learned for the future of naval warfare in the age of drones? In this video, we'll break down the battle step by step, from the initial assault to the desperate counterattacks. We'll explore the strategies used, the technologies at play, and the devastating consequences of this new era of warfare. Stay tuned as we uncover how a small, resourceful enemy could have the power to shake the foundations of one of the world's most powerful fleets. In the early hours of the attack, the Venezuelan military had been preparing for weeks, quietly setting the stage for one of the most audacious and technologically advanced strikes the world had ever seen. The U.S. Navy's carrier strike group, including the USS Ronald Reagan and its accompanying escort ships, had been patrolling international waters off the coast of South America. While the presence of such a powerful force was no surprise, what no one expected was the highly coordinated and massive drone swarm that was about to descend on them. The Venezuelan military, already under severe international sanctions and with a history of underfunded and outdated military assets, had found an unconventional and cost-effective solution. Leveraging the rapid advances in drone technology, they amassed an impressive arsenal of over 1,000 drones. Among them were Arash-2s, a medium-range, precision-guided loitering munition, capable of delivering explosive payloads to precise locations. These drones had been designed to target naval vessels, specifically aiming to cripple their radar and missile systems. Alongside them were the Shahed 136s, long-range drones that had been modified for this specific mission. These drones, originally designed for reconnaissance, had been re-engineered to carry explosive payloads and act as suicide drones, their mission to crash into their targets with deadly force. Venezuela's approach to the strike was not just about sheer numbers. It was about overwhelming the U.S. Navy's defenses with a multi-wave assault that would hit the fleet from all angles. Intelligence reports had suggested that the U.S. Navy relied heavily on its radar and missile defense systems to detect and intercept threats. To counter this, Venezuela planned a complex strategy involving simultaneous launches from multiple locations along their coastline, aiming to confuse and saturate the defenses of the U.S. fleet. The drones were launched in waves, designed to test the limits of the Navy's air defense systems. The first wave was made up of the Shahed 136s, which would serve as decoys, drawing the attention of the U.S. radar systems and overwhelming their initial response capabilities. Meanwhile, the second wave, composed of Arash-2 drones, would follow close behind, targeting the now distracted U.S. defense systems with pinpoint accuracy. The first signs of trouble began when U.S. radar operators aboard the Ronald Reagan detected an unusually high number of incoming targets. The initial readings showed over 300 contacts rapidly approaching from multiple directions. These drones were moving fast, and at first, they were assumed to be harmless civilian aircraft or routine training missions. However, as the targets drew closer, the fleet's air defense systems quickly detected the distinct signatures of hostile drones. The crew of the Ronald Reagan knew that the real danger was not just from the individual drones, but from the overwhelming numbers, designed to test every weakness in their defense grid. The attack had begun. As the drones approached, the first wave of Shahed 136s reached the carrier group. With their low radar profile and decoy-like tactics, they were difficult to intercept at first. The USS Arleigh Burke, one of the most advanced destroyers in the world, fired its first salvo of evolved Sea Sparrow missiles, ESSM, to take down the incoming threats. However, it became immediately clear that the sheer volume of the drones would strain the Navy's missile defense systems. The ESSM missiles intercepted a few, but many drones made it through, and the crew was forced to switch to the Phalanx Close-In Weapon System, CIWS, an automated defense system designed to intercept high-speed threats at close range. But even the Phalanx systems, with their rapid-fire Gatling guns, struggled to deal with the onslaught. Drones zipped through the air, narrowly missing the ship's radar towers and missile launchers. At the same time, Venezuela's military had prepared for this moment by using advanced electronic warfare tactics. In the days leading up to the strike, Venezuelan cyber operatives had infiltrated U.S. satellite communications, causing temporary disruptions in their intelligence sharing systems. This cyber attack was timed perfectly to coincide with the drone assault, further disorienting U.S. commanders and making it difficult for them to communicate effectively between ships. As the first wave of Shahed 136s was dealt with, the second wave, composed of the more lethal Arash-2 drones, began their assault. These drones were equipped with specialized targeting systems designed to home in on the ship's radar and missile systems. The Arash-2 drones moved in with precision, targeting the most critical parts of the U.S. fleet. Within minutes, several drones managed to breach the defenses, crashing into the Ronald Reagan and its escort ships, causing massive explosions. The attacks were devastating. Sections of the aircraft carrier were set ablaze, and critical command systems were destroyed. A direct hit on one of the radar systems caused a temporary blackout in the fleet's ability to detect further incoming threats. The battle was just beginning, but the first signs of the Navy's vulnerability were already apparent. The Venezuela-backed drone swarm had shown just how easily a smaller, technologically resourceful enemy could exploit the weaknesses in even the most advanced defense systems. The once mighty U.S. fleet, now battered and reeling from the initial assault, was forced to prepare for the next wave. Would the Navy be able to recover and launch a counteroffensive? Or would this unprecedented attack change the future of naval warfare forever? As the Venezuelan drones continued their relentless assault, The U.S. Navy's response was swift, but filled with a growing sense of urgency. The radar systems aboard the USS Ronald Reagan had begun to track the incoming threats. But with hundreds of targets appearing on screens in a matter of seconds, it quickly became clear that the fleet was facing a crisis. Initially, the crew assumed it was a routine skirmish, perhaps a minor distraction. But as the drones approached at high speed, their true intentions were revealed. The Ronald Reagan's radar operators, now fully aware of the magnitude of the situation, began relaying the information to the fleet's command center. The strike group commander, aboard the flagship, was immediately briefed on the incoming wave of drones. But even with decades of combat experience, nothing could have prepared him for what he was about to face. Within moments, orders were issued to launch the fleet's defensive systems. The first line of defense? The Evolved Sea Sparrow Missiles, ESSM. The Arleigh Burke destroyers fired off their first salvo, targeting the Shahed 136s that had already broken through the initial radar detection. These missiles, designed to intercept air threats, raced through the sky at supersonic speeds. The fleet watched with bated breath as the missiles found their targets. Some drones were successfully neutralized, their wreckage tumbling through the air. But many more remained, their numbers swarming toward the ships like a plague of locusts. With the situation worsening by the second, the Ronald Reagan and its escorts activated their close-in weapon system, CIWS. The phalanx systems began spinning, rapidly firing thousands of rounds at any drone within range. The powerful Gatling guns unleashed a hailstorm of bullets, tearing into the air as the drones swerved and dodged. But the speed at which the drones were coming made it almost impossible to intercept them all. The phalanx systems, designed for close-range defense, began to show signs of strain. More drones slipped through the gaps, their payloads intact, ready to strike the vulnerable areas of the fleet. The tension was palpable. The once invincible USS Ronald Reagan was under direct threat, and there was little time to make adjustments. It was clear that the U.S. Navy had underestimated the complexity of the Venezuelan strategy. The drones weren't merely random, disorganized attacks. They were part of a well-thought-out plan. The Venezuelans had anticipated that the initial wave of drones would overwhelm the fleet's external defenses. And they were right. The Shahed 136s had indeed distracted and exhausted the ESSMs and CIWS, leaving the fleet vulnerable to the next phase of the assault. But the Ronald Reagan wasn't out of options just yet. The fleet's commander ordered an immediate deployment of the Navy's secret weapon, the electronic warfare, EW systems. Within moments, the EA-18G Growler, a specialized electronic warfare aircraft, roared into the sky. This formidable aircraft, capable of jamming enemy communications and radar systems, was quickly dispatched to counter the threat. The Growler's mission was clear: disrupt the Venezuelan drones' communication systems, severing their connection to the launch control stations and causing them to veer off course. As the Growler activated its jamming systems, a wave of calm washed over the fleet. The jamming signals began to disrupt the drones' coordination, and for a brief moment, it appeared that the threat had been mitigated. However, the Venezuelan military had been preparing for this very contingency. In a bid to counter the electronic warfare, they had outfitted their drones with a sophisticated system designed to fight back against the jamming efforts. The drones, once thought to be vulnerable to disruption, began to adjust their flight patterns and re-establish communication with their launch stations. It was a sophisticated countermeasure that few outside the intelligence community had predicted. As the drones continued to press forward, the fleet's defense systems found themselves in a constant battle of cat and mouse. For every threat neutralized, another wave emerged. The sheer number of drones seemed endless. The USS Ronald Reagan, once a symbol of U.S. naval supremacy, was beginning to show cracks in its armor. The radar systems, though sophisticated, were overwhelmed by the number of incoming threats. The ESSMs fired again, but the drones kept coming. The CIWS systems spun tirelessly, attempting to pick off as many drones as they could, but it was clear that this would not be a quick battle. With the first wave of drones still causing chaos, the Ronald Reagan and its accompanying ships began to employ evasive maneuvers. The carrier was not built for high-speed evasions, but desperate times called for desperate measures. As the crew scrambled to implement defensive tactics, the rest of the strike group coordinated their efforts, with missile systems, countermeasures, and jamming equipment working in tandem to protect the flagship. But as the sun rose on the horizon, the crew knew that this was not a simple attack. It was an all-out assault designed to break their defenses and force the U.S. Navy to reevaluate its entire approach to modern warfare. What had started as a single wave of drones was now a full-scale, high-tech battle that no one could predict. As the relentless waves of drones continued to hammer the U.S. Navy's strike group, it became evident that a traditional defense against such an unprecedented attack was not going to be enough. While the ESSMs and CIWS systems had performed admirably in intercepting many of the threats, they were still not enough to completely thwart the assault. The Venezuelan drones, with their sheer numbers and unrelenting waves, had forced the U.S. Navy to push its defensive systems to their limits. In this high-tech battle, the next phase was all about innovation and adaptability, as the Navy had to deploy every possible asset to keep its vessels from succumbing to the attack. As the first wave of drones reached their targets, it was clear that the USS Ronald Reagan had sustained significant damage. But the real shock came when the fleet's electronic warfare systems were activated. The EA-18G Growler, a powerful aircraft designed to cripple enemy electronics, was scrambled and immediately engaged in an all-out battle against the Venezuelan drone swarm. The Growler's main mission was to disrupt the drones' communication systems, hoping to sever the link between the drones and their command stations back in Venezuela. Electronic warfare tactics were crucial in neutralizing the swarm, and this was the moment when the Navy's strategic use of these advanced systems was tested like never before. The Growler's sophisticated jamming systems began to pulse in the airwaves, scrambling the frequencies that the Venezuelan drones relied on to navigate and execute commands. For a brief moment, the U.S. Navy seemed to have gained the upper hand as several drones veered off course, their pre-programmed missions thrown into disarray. Some drones lost their connection to their operators and began to drift aimlessly, while others malfunctioned mid-flight, exploding in mid-air. The fleet's crew breathed a sigh of relief, thinking the tide had turned. However, this moment of relief was short-lived. The Venezuelan military, keenly aware of the potential vulnerabilities of their drone force, had anticipated the Navy's use of electronic warfare. In a move that shocked even the most seasoned analysts, they had outfitted many of their drones with advanced countermeasures, specifically designed to neutralize jamming attempts. These drones were equipped with anti-jamming systems that allowed them to reconnect to their launch platforms even when the Growler's signals were at full intensity. It was a sophisticated defense mechanism that caught the U.S. Navy completely off guard. The drones that had lost their connections quickly re-established communication with their launch stations, and within minutes, they were back on their intended course, closing in on the vulnerable parts of the fleet. At the same time, the fleet's electronic warfare specialists continued their battle against the drones, trying desperately to outmaneuver the Venezuelan countermeasures. The Growler was joined by a series of Navy vessels, which began to emit their own electronic interference, creating a complex electronic fog around the strike group. But the Venezuelan drones were relentless. They adapted to each new interference signal, using a mix of pre-programmed routes and reactive tactics to bypass the Navy's defenses. It was as if the enemy had anticipated every move and had countered them with a level of sophistication that left the Navy scrambling to keep up. While the U.S. Navy was fighting to regain control of the airwaves, the drones themselves continued to penetrate deeper into the fleet's defenses. A few of the more resilient drones had already breached the outer perimeter of the strike group, and the damage they caused was staggering. One of the drones managed to strike a critical radar system aboard the USS Ronald Reagan. The resulting explosion sent a shockwave through the ship, temporarily blinding the fleet's radar capabilities. The loss of such an essential system was catastrophic. Without radar, the Ronald Reagan was now almost entirely reliant on its secondary systems to track the incoming drones. This left the ship even more vulnerable, with precious seconds lost between detecting threats and launching countermeasures. On board, the situation was quickly spiraling out of control. Crew members worked tirelessly to contain fires and damage, but with every passing minute, the ship was becoming harder to defend. The Ronald Reagan systems were designed to repel enemy missiles and aircraft, not a mass attack by cheap, fast-moving drones. The chaos on board was palpable. Officers barked orders into the chaos, trying to maintain control while the crew responded to fires, evacuations, and system failures. The damage was being done, and with each successful drone strike, it became clear that this attack was not going to be easily overcome. Meanwhile, the USS Arleigh Burke, which had been acting as the primary escort for the carrier, faced similar challenges. Although the destroyer's Aegis combat system was widely considered one of the most advanced missile defense systems in the world, it too was stretched thin. The Arleigh Burke launched its own countermeasures, but the sheer volume of incoming drones quickly overwhelmed its ability to respond effectively. The Aegis system could handle a few missiles or aircraft, but thousands of low-flying drones with explosive payloads were an entirely different kind of threat. The ship's radar system was on the brink of failure, and while it successfully intercepted a few incoming drones, the barrage continued. The Arleigh Burke's crew knew that without further support, they too would be outmatched. Despite the damage, the U.S. Navy was not ready to surrender. In a desperate attempt to push back the wave of drones, the fleet began a counteroffensive. The remaining ships launched their own missile strikes toward Venezuela's drone launch sites, hoping to take out the remaining supply of unmanned aircraft before they could launch another wave. At the same time, the Navy's aircraft were scrambled, launching from the deck of the USS Ronald Reagan to target drone control centers in Venezuela. The hope was that destroying the command infrastructure would sever the link between the drones and their operators, effectively crippling the attack. However, the situation was far from simple. Venezuela had anticipated this move as well. Its drone command centers were scattered in remote locations, well protected and designed to survive such strikes. The Navy's aircraft managed to destroy several smaller command stations, but the main hubs remained intact, connected through a secure satellite communication network that was nearly impossible to disrupt. It became clear that this was a multi-layered operation, a strategy designed to keep the U.S. Navy on its back foot at every turn. As the attack continued, the U.S. Navy began to take stock of the damage. The USS Ronald Reagan was still afloat, but its capabilities were severely compromised. The loss of radar and critical navigation systems, coupled with fires and structural damage, had reduced its operational effectiveness. The Arleigh Burke was in a similar state, with its missile systems heavily damaged and its radar barely functioning. The fleet's morale was low, but they had not given up. The Navy's command began to prepare for a more aggressive counterattack, knowing full well that without decisive action, the strike group would be forced to retreat. The damage to the fleet was significant, but the attack also had a profound impact on the strategic landscape of naval warfare. The use of drones in this manner was a revelation, a stark reminder of how the future of warfare might look, where small, relatively inexpensive drones could inflict massive damage on powerful military vessels. It was a wake-up call for the U.S. Navy, one that would lead to sweeping changes in how they approach defense and warfare in the years to come. As the smoke from the wreckage cleared and the fleet slowly began to assess the full extent of the damage, the reality of the situation began to sink in. The attack, while eventually repelled, had left the U.S. Navy's carrier strike group severely compromised. The once mighty USS Ronald Reagan had been battered by drone strikes, leaving it partially incapacitated. Radar systems were down, critical navigation controls had been damaged, and sections of the aircraft carrier were still burning hours after the initial strikes. The same fate had befallen the USS Arleigh Burke, with its missile systems inoperable and its radar systems on the brink of collapse. The high-tech defense systems that had once been considered nearly invincible had faltered under the weight of an unprecedented multi-wave drone assault. For the U.S. Navy, this wasn't just a defeat in terms of physical damage. It was a stark revelation about the vulnerabilities in their approach to modern warfare. The strategic lessons that emerged from this battle were immense. First, It was clear that traditional defense systems, no matter how advanced, had significant weaknesses when faced with an overwhelming number of threats. The ESSMs and CIWS, while effective in some instances, could not cope with the sheer volume of drones attacking from all directions. The Navy had relied too heavily on high-tech yet singular defense systems without considering the multifaceted nature of modern asymmetrical warfare. The drones, although not as advanced as some of the Navy's systems, had successfully exploited these vulnerabilities, showing how a smaller, less technologically advanced adversary could still inflict serious damage through sheer numbers, strategic innovation, and the right timing. This was the first major realization. The U.S. Navy would need to rethink its strategy for countering drone threats. Future fleet defense would need to integrate more adaptive, layered systems that could address multiple types of threats simultaneously: high-tech and low-tech, large and small. The Navy would have to consider incorporating not only conventional missile defense and radar systems, but also enhance electronic warfare capabilities and drone-specific countermeasures that could react more fluidly to evolving threats. The Venezuelan attack had shown that drones could be an equalizer in naval combat, capable of challenging even the most powerful fleets in the world. Furthermore, the role of electronic warfare had been highlighted as a key area of focus. The EA-18G Growler's initial success in disrupting the Venezuelan drones had proven invaluable, but the countermeasures deployed by the drones themselves underscored the need for more advanced, flexible jamming systems. The Navy's reliance on existing electronic warfare platforms would need to evolve, incorporating real-time adaptive systems that could counter enemy tactics in a constantly shifting battlefield. The attack had revealed the limits of the current systems and demonstrated the importance of staying one step ahead in the electronic warfare domain. The human cost of the attack also became evident. Although the majority of the crew had been able to weather the initial storm and perform damage control under extreme pressure, the strain of managing fires, injuries, and the chaos of an ongoing assault had taken its toll. The Navy's response had been commendable in many respects, but it was clear that training for such a high-tech, unpredictable battle would need to be enhanced. The attack had forced the crew to work under conditions they were not fully prepared for, and it would be a long road to recovery, both in terms of physical repairs to the ships and mental recovery for those who had experienced the intense, life-threatening moments of the battle.